Good evening. I'm Gretchen Crosby Sims, the Executive Director here at the Institute of Politics. We are pleased to welcome to campus Brian Hook, U.S. Special Representative for Iran and Senior Policy Advisor to the Secretary of State, and welcome back to New York Times National Security Correspondent David Sanger. National security is a fitting topic for our discussion on this Veterans Day, and we'd like to express our appreciation to our veterans and their families for their sacrifices that they've made in service of our democracy and our values. Before we get started, I want to mention a few upcoming events. This Wednesday, IOP Pritzker Fellow Heather McGee will moderate a panel on grassroots organizing in Chicago, featuring representatives from several of Chicago's most effective community organizations. And on Friday, Michelle Norris, former host of NPR's All Things Considered, will be discussing her race card project, its legacy, and how it can help us understand politics in America today. To learn more about upcoming IOP events, please sign up for our newsletter at politics.uchicago.edu. We will have audience questions after the discussion. We will have a microphone in the center aisle, and we remind you that the first three questions are always reserved for students, and we'd like to remind you that questions do end in question marks. Please do make sure that your phones are on silent, and if you need them, restrooms are downstairs. And now to formally introduce our guests is Malak Arafa. Malak is a third year from Cairo, Egypt, studying political science and history. During her time at the IOP, she has been involved in leading the student-run International Policy Program Events Committee, and she is its co-chair this year. Please join me in welcoming her to the podium.
Today, we are honored to be joined by Mr. Brian Hook. Mr. Hook currently serves as U.S. Special Representative for Iran and is a senior policy advisor to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Mr. Hook has held many high-level positions in the Bush administration, including Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs and Senior Advisor to the U.S. Ambassador to the UN. Since being appointed to his current position in August of 2018, Mr. Hook has been at the forefront of U.S.-Iran policy and has become one of the most influential voices on the topic. We are also delighted to have David Sanger of the New York Times joining us as our moderator for tonight's discussion. Mr. Sanger is a national security correspondent and a senior writer for the New York Times and has been with the Times for the past 36 years. He has been on 3 teams that have won Pulitzer Prizes, most recently in 2017 for international reporting. He is also the author of 2 Times bestsellers on foreign policy and national security. His latest book, The Perfect Weapon: War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age, is an excellent read on how cyber conflict has changed the nature of and dynamic between global powers. Mr. Hook, Mr. Sanger, we are delighted to have you both with us tonight, and we thank you for sharing your insights with us. Please join me in welcoming Brian Hook and David Sanger.
Well, thank you, Malak, for that introduction. Thanks for having us back here, and thanks to Brian for braving the snows. I was here all weekend, so it was easy, but Brian just barely made it in under the wire here. We weren't expecting this kind of weather prior to Thanksgiving. It was a reminder of what you all put up with living in Chicago. But you get all of this along the way. So. Brian and I have known each other for a while, and we've had a lot of conversations about Iran along the way. Sometimes we've agreed, sometimes we've disagreed, but that's always made it a lot more fun, and we're good friends. I thought I would kick the conversation off today with some questions to Brian about how this whole thing is going, swimmingly, as you can tell. And then we'll probably at some point in the course of this switch roles a little bit and talk a little bit about cyber in Iran as well, and then go to all of your questions. So Brian, let's start with the newest news, the things that have been going on in the past week. So we've had a busy week from the Iranians. They announced if I've got my count right, their 3rd cycle of pulling back from what's in Washington we call the JCPOA and what normal human beings call the Iran agreement. That means that they've announced that they not only are stepping up their production of uranium, which of course can be used either as fuel for nuclear power or if you keep enriching it to a nuclear bomb. They've also announced that they're beginning to introduce uranium into a deep underground site called Fordo, that when it was disclosed, its existence was disclosed at the very beginning of the Obama administration in 2009, looked like its mere existence might trigger the Israelis to go bomb the site. Today, this afternoon, that got condemned by the European partners in the Iran agreement, which was an unusual step for them because until now, mostly they've just been critical of you and your colleagues for leaving the Iran agreement a year ago, and there's been a lot of friction. So tell me where we are. Are the Iranians on their way to making a weapon, trying to convince you that they could make a weapon, or are they just using this as a reversible negotiating ploy to get the Europeans to basically make up for the sanctions we've had?
It may be some combination of all three. I think the Iranian regime historically has used nuclear extortion, nuclear blackmail as a way to get benefits from various countries. It's the threat of Iran becoming a nuclear weapons state. They are the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. And so that would change the balance of power in the Middle East enormously if Iran were to acquire a nuclear weapon. And so for some time, essentially since the IAEA, the UN nuclear watchdog, referred Iran's nuclear program to the UN Security Council in 2006, it's been a concern. Iran's nuclear program has been a concern now for well over a decade. This is a bipartisan issue, and there is nobody in the United States Congress who wants Iran to get a nuclear weapon. We have differences, as you pointed out, with our European partners, but those are tactical disagreements. We are in complete agreement that Iran can never have a nuclear weapon. They are breaching the Iran nuclear deal. And the argument that the Iranians give is to the Europeans, well, the economic benefits that you promised us have all vanished because the United States left the Iran deal. And when we left the deal, we ended up largely taking the economic benefits with us.
And actually reimposing sanctions that had been suspended under the deal in return for them suspending a lot of their nuclear activity.
Exactly. I think that was roughly the agreement. It was economic relief in exchange for temporary, I would describe it as temporary and modest non-proliferation benefits, because the Iran nuclear deal expires. And it starts expiring in 11 months, and it's going to continue to expire until all of the restrictions under the Iran deal are gone.
But just so for those who haven't followed this each and every step along the way, lucky, right? More fortunate than the two of us. While elements of it do expire over time, the primary one, which kept them from producing nuclear material in whatever volume they want, expires 15 years from when the deal was signed, when the deal went into effect. It went into effect in early 2016. So basically, until the president decided to pull out, assuming the Iranians complied with the deal, you would have had until roughly 2030 before they would have been able to produce in a volume that could have given them a weapon.
Yeah, I think
is that accurate?
That's the theory of the case. Mm-hmm. And I think the theory of the case was that by getting into an agreement, the Europeans have tried to get Iran into a nuclear agreement prior to the Iran nuclear deal, and Iran breached it. And so I think the Europeans were very happy to finally get an agreement with the Iranians. Iran was in compliance with the deal. We argue that it created a very low bar for compliance. And my view is that for as long as Iran was receiving the economic benefits, we shouldn't be surprised that they're continuing to comply. So now the Europeans, we're out of the deal, and being outside of the deal has given us enormous leverage to be able to put sanctions on the regime, and that's been mostly around oil sanctions and banking sanctions. And we have been very effective at that. For those that are still in the deal, Iran has decided to take an approach of less for less. If we get less economic benefits, you will get less compliance. And so over the last roughly 90 days or so, they have been diminishing their compliance. And then just about an hour ago, the foreign ministers of the United Kingdom, France, and Germany issued a statement expressing sort of extreme concern that Iran is now going down this road of breaking its commitments. Iran will say that we broke the commitments, and so we're within our right to start doing it. But it's the big question to look for is whether the Europeans decide to take this issue to the UN Security Council, and essentially, it's called the dispute resolution mechanism, which gives Iran a chance to come back into compliance. But if they don't, and the Europeans then go to the UN Security Council and say they can snap back all of the UN sanctions that are still lifted. And that would be a very big moment if the UN sanctions were to come back into place, the ones that were negotiated by Bush and Obama in those administrations. All of those would come back on Iran's nuclear and missile program. And that's the big question for the Europeans, is at what point do they give up on the JCPOA, the Iran deal, go to the UN and force the snapback of UN sanctions?
Well, we'll get in a moment to the different theories of the case, Obama's theory, the Trump theory of the case, the sort of middle ground one. But let's just pursue something you said there, which is the Iranians are making the argument that they had been in compliance and would remain in compliance had it not been for the fact that President Trump in, was it April or May of 2018? Yep. May of 2018 decided to withdraw the United States and reimpose sanctions. So they're making the argument about this agreement in a way that sort of parallel the argument that President Trump makes about the Russians with a nuclear treaty that he left recently involving medium-range missiles in Europe, which is, why would we stay in an agreement that the Russians are already violating? So when the Iranians come back to you and say, yeah, we're violating it now in a very calculated piece-by-piece way, you wouldn't advise staying in a deal the other side was violating. How do you answer them?
Well, the Iran nuclear deal was, a lot of people aren't aware of this, but the Iran nuclear deal has no signatures. It's not an agreement. And I was in a meeting with Iran's foreign minister, and he said, it's a plan of action, because we couldn't even agree to call it an agreement, so we called it a plan. And he said it doesn't enjoy much support in Iran.
No, it doesn't. That's right. Americans sort of missed that.
Well, no, this is while we were in the deal.
Yeah, that's right.
While we were in the deal.
The conservatives in Iran thought their government gave away the store, and conservatives in the United States thought Obama gave away the store.
Maybe not even conservatives. You had a number of folks like Senator Schumer and Congressman Engel. There were a number of Democrats in the Congress that opposed the deal.
That's right.
Also, the ranking member of Senate Foreign Relations, Menendez, opposed it. It did not enjoy a lot of support. And so our view, my private view at the time when I was out of office, was that I thought the Iran nuclear deal met the criteria of a non-proliferation agreement that should have been submitted to the Senate for ratification. The administration did not have the votes in the Senate. That's right. And so they didn't have the votes in the Senate, so they found the votes in the UN Security Council. And they kind of memorialized the Iran nuclear deal. And that is what's still in place today. We left it. We think that it puts us in a much better position to accomplish, I think, the universally agreed upon goal to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. We think it's the best way to do it. I would say that we pulled forward the expiration date of the Iran nuclear deal. As I said, it's going to expire. The problem is that if you let the deal run its course, Iran will be in a much stronger position economically, much stronger. It'll be stronger economically. Its proxies will be stronger, both economically and militarily. And so what we wanted to do was address the problem now and not try to address it at the end. One of the questions I put to many of my friends who worked on the Iran nuclear deal is, what is the plan when it expires? And there isn't an answer to it. But we do know that given the enormous economic benefits that flowed to Iran under the deal, that by the time it expires, it will be much stronger. And we thought it's better to pull the expiration dates forward and then come up with a new and better deal. We would like to get to a new deal that addresses not just the nuclear threat that Iran presents to peace and security, but the missile threat and the regional aggression and the hostage-taking of American citizens, which continues to this day. You have a number of Americans who today are in Evin prison, and they're innocent. And so this hostage taking has been a feature. Just last week, we observed the 40th anniversary of the American diplomats in Tehran being taken hostage, and they were held for a year and a half.
444 days.
Yeah.
Right.
And so they're still doing this. So we would like to get to a deal that is comprehensive, truly comprehensive. To get to that kind of deal is going to require leverage, and we have been aggregating through our economic pressure campaign and diplomatic isolation. We've been aggregating the kind of leverage that will be necessary to accomplish the deal that we think will be enduring, permanent, and we will submit it to the Senate as a treaty.
Okay, so you've laid out basically President Trump's theory of the case of how this is going to work, which is by reimposing sanctions, Iran is, as the president likes to say, a different country today, much weaker. Its oil revenues have dropped by my counting, at least 75%, something like that.
Probably a little bit higher.
So higher than 75, you think?
I think so.
So they're hurting, and they're looking to put leverage back on you by reimposing the deal. So everybody's got their maximum leverage campaign. Yours is using sanctions. Theirs is beginning to build up uranium enrichment capability again.
And the attacks on Saudi and on the Houthis and the attacks off Fujairah.
Right, we'll get to in a moment. Yeah. So they're putting some nuclear pressure on.
Right.
Kinetic pressure. Because they're running out of money, they're having a hard time supporting terrorist groups the way they once did, but they're still doing it. So that's the Trump theory of the case. The Obama theory of the case, and I covered these negotiations along the way, and our last trip to Vienna for negotiations, we were told was going to be 10 days. It was 5 weeks, although I discovered you don't get any sympathy from your colleagues when you send a note saying, I'm stuck in Vienna for 5 weeks.
It's a great
So President Obama's theory was, 15 years is not long enough. We wish that it was longer, but it's long enough to get us past the current supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, who's in his late 70s, early 80s at this point, right? Not in the most robust of health. So the theory was that by the time it expired, there would be new leadership in Iran. Maybe it would be worse, maybe it would be better, and that you would have time in between to work with the Iranians on some other things. ISIS, maybe redeveloping their oil industry, doing things to integrate them in the economy enough that they wouldn't feel the necessity to have a nuclear program. So that was his bet. And then there was your old boss, Rex Tillerson, and H.R. McMaster, remember him? 2 national security advisors ago, right? But he wasn't the first, he was the second. And then there was a third, your old boss, John Bolton, or as we say at the New York Times, we're actually at the point where the president has had more national security advisors than he has had wives. So, but McMaster and Tillerson had a common theory, which was don't ditch the existing deal, but build on top of it. Do what you suggested, get a missile deal on top of it, get a restraint on support of terrorism on top of it, but don't give them the out of violating it because we violated it. So take those 2 on. What's your critique of the Obama approach, and what's your critique of the Tillerson approach?
Good questions. I think let me start with the Obama approach. They were given $150 billion in sanctions relief, and then $1.5 billion in cash. And
which was their $1.5 billion that was getting unfrozen.
And there was also some money that was held up from '79.
Right, they had paid us for arms that we never delivered because of the Iranian Revolution, and they wanted their money back.
Right. So I think they got it back. So they were given an enormous amount of sanctions relief, and in one of the preambular paragraphs of the Iran nuclear deal is that it says this agreement will contribute to promoting regional peace and stability and international sort of thing. My question is, why would Iran spend less money on terrorism if given more money to spend on terrorism? This is just the nature. I recently gave a speech at Asia Society during the UN General Assembly. Looked at what Ayatollah Khomeini was saying in 78 and 79. He's not talking about domination of the Middle East. It is a project of world domination. And this is the last revolutionary regime on earth. You can't say that about North Korea because it's a hermit kingdom. Putin under Russia doesn't have its revolutionary sort of dimension to it that it did.
The Chinese have lost their revolutionary fervor.
Well, the Chinese have a mercantilist sort of. It's not what it used to be. So this is still a very ideological regime that wants to export a model of governance of clerical rule. And you know, what's interesting about the Islamic Republic, which is endlessly fascinating, is it does have all of some of the, I would say, the storefront of a Westphalian democracy. It has a president, it has elections, it has a foreign minister, but then it has this layer of revolutionary and clerical oversight. And that is what runs the country. They're the ones that determine who get to run. And so it is a republic in name only. But this is a regime that sees itself as a revolutionary regime. The Iran deal, I think, under the prior administration there was a bet, and David described this a little bit. The idea was that you would empower the moderates and help them gain the ascendancy. And then over time, the hardliners would fall away. 2/3 of Iranians were born after the revolution. And
very young population.
Very young population. It's very Western, very secular, in spite of having a regime which is...
And would love nothing more than visas so that they can come study at the University of Chicago and places like it.
I think that's very true. So I think it was a bet that I just wouldn't have made, because I don't see any evidence, even at the time, that the regime had any intent to moderate. And then if you look at its record, so they start negotiating the Iran deal sometime around 2013, roughly in that period. There was some back-channel diplomacy that starts prior to that with Jake Sullivan and Bill Burns. Mm-hmm. From 2013 to about 2017 or 18, Iran spent $16 billion in Syria, supporting Assad, Iraq, and in Yemen. And so they have spent the sanctions relief supporting their proxies around the region, who today are, well, when we came into office, were very strong. And we're getting stronger because Iran was able to subsidize so much of their operations. You see this especially with the Houthis in Yemen. They've been organizing, training, and equipping the Houthis and funding them hundreds of millions of dollars for the last three plus years. So we believe that the best thing that you can do is to starve the regime of funds and make it force the decision that it has to take between guns in Syria or butter in Tehran. And we think that's a much better policy to be in. We have not gotten into this trap of sort of figuring out where are the hardliners and the moderates in the regime. If you're in the regime, even if you're Javad Zarif, the foreign minister that everybody enjoys, he's funny, charming, the whole thing, he is the spokesman for a brutal, theocratic, violent regime that has for 40 years been conducting terror operations across 5 continents. And we think that this is the right policy to put in place. We think that we're more likely to accomplish our objectives through this route than by placing a really risky bet on moderates emerging in the regime. They have not emerged in this regime.
Okay, and take us to the middle choice. So from the time that President Trump came in to the day that he signed the agreement, or the day he signed the order that pulled us out of the agreement, a number of people, including you, were working away on trying to see if you could modify the existing accord. And in fact, you were in Europe up until the last days before the president pulled out, trying to go negotiate what that would look like. What was wrong with that approach? Because it would have kept the Iranians inside the agreement, but had the chance of getting the Europeans on board to expanding it to missiles and terrorism.
We did inherit the deal, but as soon as we came into office, we did put in place sanctions that were at least available to us outside of the deal. And so we put those in place. started, we just took a different approach to Iran. And at a certain point, the president decided, it was in February of 2018, he said, okay, I'm going to give 6 months to see if we can fix the Iran deal. And so he made a statement that said, I need this deal can't expire because it's called sunset clauses, so the deal expires. He wanted to end the sunset clauses. He wanted a stronger inspections regime so that we had greater visibility into Iran's nuclear program. And there's no mention of intercontinental ballistic missiles. And if you are a rogue regime and you want to get a nuclear bomb, you need to have the delivery system. And for the Iranians, and for pretty much any country, whether it's North Korea or Iran, you need an intercontinental ballistic missile to deliver the nuclear bomb. You have to weaponize the bomb. There was no mention of ICBMs, and the Iran nuclear deal ended the prohibition that was in the United Nations Security Council on Iran's ballistic missile testing. So these were the deficiencies that we wanted to address. So
It didn't end it, but it weakened it. It weakened the language.
Well, it went from a prohibition.
Thou shalt not to.
It was a Chapter 7 full Security Council prohibition that then went to calls upon, and the Iranians interpreted that as a green light. And Iran's ballistic missile testing increased after the deal.
So your argument is that the original agreement was flawed in part because while it covered the weapons, it didn't cover the delivery systems. And it's ridiculous to do this if you're only doing half of it.
Exactly, because these always walk arm in arm. If there's a weapons program, it walks arm in arm with the delivery system, and that's you have to miniaturize the warhead, and then you have to get the missile system. And if your enemy is the United States, you need an ICBM to deliver it.
It's funny you should mention this because fortunately for you, you deal with Iran, and there's another special envoy, your friend Steve Biegun, who deals with North Korea. But one of the questions I've asked Steve at various moments is, if you're so concerned with this critique of the Iran deal, which I agree is a flaw in the Iran deal, why are we not negotiating with the North Koreans over their missiles as well? We're just doing that over nuclear. There's no missile discussion at least in what the president has so far discussed with Kim Jong-un.
That's a question for Steve. I'll stick with Iran for now. Steve works next door to me. I'll send him your regards. Right. I'll send him your regards. Yeah. So we needed to add in ICBMs. So the president said, end the sunsets, stronger inspections regime, and we need to add ICBMs. So that was the charge. I spent a group of us from the White House, State Department, DOD. I led a delegation, and we spent 6 months between Berlin, London, Paris, and Washington, seeing if we could come to an agreement. We were able to get agreement on the ICBMs. This is just with the Brits, the French, and the Germans. That was kind of the Russians and the Chinese were not involved in those negotiations. So we got agreement on the ICBMs, we got agreement on inspections, but we could not bridge our differences on sunsets. And the Europeans thought that this was we would be rewriting the Iran deal. And that would be unfair to the Iranians.
The others were add-ons, but the Iranians had negotiated 15 years in return for certain things, and that you would basically be tearing apart the old deal to change.
So here's how we looked at it. So
the sunset.
The Iran deal roughly keeps Iran from nuclear breakout of 1 year. That is the standard that's in the Iran deal. You don't want the Iranian regime, if they decide tomorrow, we're going to race to a nuclear weapon. You always want to keep them at least 1 year outside of that in terms of the nuclear enrichment piece. Then you've also got the other dimensions to it. But that's the 1 year standard. Our view was that can't expire, extended in perpetuity.
You always want to keep them 1 year out.
At a minimum. So what we've done, when we got out of the deal, what Secretary Pompeo came in after the president left the deal, we restored the United Nations standard of no enrichment at all. And that was something which I negotiated when I was on the UN Security Council. No enrichment. After the IAEA reported Iran to the UN Security Council, the council passed a resolution unanimously, this is China and Russia voting for it, that said that Iran is prohibited from enriching fissile material. That is the right policy. And I wasn't there for it, but the negotiators of the Iran nuclear deal gave that up.
And so they replaced it with a 1 year to give us enough warning time.
Yeah, exactly, a one-year thing. So we think we need to restore that standard. So when you look at Secretary Pompeo, he gave a speech after we left the deal, and he calls its list of 12 requirements. These are the things that we're looking for. And at the top of the list is no enrichment. We think that's much more likely to avoid an arms race in the Middle East, because if you today go to take your average Arab country and say, you know what, we'd like to work out an agreement with you, a gold standard, a 1, 2, 3 agreement. You'll have peaceful nuclear power, but you can't enrich. And that exists with the United Arab Emirates. They signed up for that in the Bush administration. But if you go to a country today and say, hey, we'd like to sign you up for the gold standard, they'd say, you know what, we'll take the deal you gave Iran, because they would like to enrich. If Iran's going to enrich, then they're going to want to enrich. So we think the much better policy is to then moot the question of breakout and just have no enrichment.
Which is what you did with the UAE.
The UAE signed up to you remember this, it's called the 1, 2, 3 agreement. Iran can have all the peaceful nuclear power it desires. It can't enrich. And if you look at all the countries around the world that have peaceful nuclear power, well more than half have no enrichment capability. And Iran can have the same thing.
So Brian, let's go back for a second to this 1-year standard, because it sounds technical, but it's really interesting, which is if you have a full year of warning, in other words, if it would take you a year to make enough material to make a single bomb, then you've got reaction time. You can gather the Europeans. If you decide there's a military solution, you can put your military plan together. If you decide there's a diplomatic solution, you can try that. You can run those in parallel. So if you and I were sitting here at the end of last semester for these students, we would say they were at least a year out still, because they had not broken out of the agreement. But now they have. They've done 3 successive breakouts. Would you say that they are less than a year away from a weapon right now? I'm sorry, less than a year away from having enough material to build a single weapon right now?
Our assessment on that, on anything involving breakout, is classified, so we don't talk about it publicly. I'm just sort of explaining that the theory for the Iran deal negotiators was that 1 year out. We're trying to get it to no enrichment.
But let me press you on this, because during the passage of the deal, in the hearings in Congress and so forth, Ernie Moniz, who was the Secretary of Energy at the time, testified that that agreement kept them at least 1 year out, okay? And they reaffirmed that in public, unclassified, several times during the course of it. So are you telling me you can't now say whether or not, you can't publicly say whether they are less than a year away?
In terms of the decisions that they've taken over the last number of months, the steps they've taken, they make a lot of claims, and so the IAEA in Vienna is the one that has inspectors in Iran, and they're the ones that are supposed to help verify.
And they turned out a report today.
They put out, yep, exactly, a report
that said
today.
the Iranians have been violating the agreement in just the ways they've said they have.
Yeah. So we don't, I don't have an answer for you on that.
You can't say today whether they are still at least 1 year away from a...
But we haven't said it. Our policy is that Iran we shouldn't have any enrichment at all. We would like to steer the discussion in that direction, which would then get us out of this business of whether are they below a year or are they above a year. That's a much better place to be in.
So if I'm the Israelis and I'm looking at this is a really big deal, because the 1 year was important to them, because the 1 year declaration meant they did not have to turn around and immediately make the decision about whether to take military action. Are you suggesting, I mean, if you declare publicly that they're less than a year, the Israelis are likely, when they get done doing all the other things they're busy doing, like picking a prime minister, they might actually turn to the question of whether or not they need to consider military action again.
The United States and Israel work very closely together on this, but this is beyond just the US and Israel. If you talk to any of these countries in the region, they all have the same concern, that Iran cannot get to a nuclear weapon. And so I think for the Iranians, the more that they engage in this sort of nuclear gamesmanship, it increases the odds that they're going to lose, that the patience will have run out for Russia, China, the E3, and others, and we will see Iran back in the UN Security Council with all the sanctions put back in place. So I don't, Iran has been kind of just one click at a time They haven't raced, but they have been very strategic about their violations. And they are in a material breach, but they're not enriching at 20%.
Right, which
They're
would be
enriching
most of the way to a bomb,
Yeah.
if you did that.
And they would say that that's for medical isotope purposes.
Right.
But when you get up to, so right now I think the latest numbers that they announced were like 4% purity, and they had a stockpile of uranium hexafluoride around like 300 kilograms.
Most of their uranium got shipped out to Russia at
Exactly.
the end of the agreement.
Right.
And you have that to thank the Obama administration for, because had they not shipped that out, today they'd be sitting on a big stockpile that would enable them to build a weapon.
So we are trying to, I think at the end of all of this, Iran doesn't have a lot of ceiling. I think they've got a fairly low ceiling of what they're able to get away with. They have conducted the attack on Saudi Arabia on September 14th. They bombed the East-West pipeline. They bombed oil tankers. They've shot down 3 of our drones. But that is not a limitless ceiling. And they're already losing the E3. They're losing the E3 in a number of statements. You're seeing the E3 becoming increasingly concerned. Today, for the first time, the E3 mentioned the dispute resolution mechanism. So the amount of latitude Iran has, I think, is somewhat limited. So we very much like the position that we're in.
So if I was an Iranian strategist right now and I was trying to figure out what to go do about this, I would say, I've got to increase my pain on the US in some other ways. That merely doing these violations of the agreement, going to concern the US, but since, as I said, most of the fuel has been shipped out of the country, it would take them a long time to build up enough fuel to have a significant arsenal. They're nowhere near where the North Koreans are with it. So I think I do my things in other arenas. I've written a lot about their cyber capability. They've built that up in recent times. How concerned are you that they're going to say, we can't build a weapon between now and November 2020, but we can sure help the Russians out in messing around with the election in 2020?
Well, you have seen, there have been, I think, thousands of accounts on Facebook and Twitter that were spreading misinformation, and that these were Iranian.
They were Iranian accounts, not just Russian accounts.
Right, these are Iranian accounts, and this has now happened a few times. And so Iran, and I'd love to hear David's thoughts on this in terms of where Iran is now, but over the last 10 years, over the last decade, Iran has conducted cyber operations against the United States, against Saudi, Israel, Qatar, and other nations. And they had that denial of service attack against Saudi Aramco.
That was before they shot missiles at Saudi Aramco's facilities a few months ago.
It's true. So Saudi Aramco has been a regular target for the regime. I think since we've largely zeroed out Iran's export of oil, and I think Iran's position is that no oil for us, no oil for you. But they have not succeeded in spiking the price of oil, and Saudi has been able to ensure an uninterrupted supply of oil to the customers that largely Iran has lost because of our sanctions. But on the cyber piece, going back to it, they are one of the leading cyber capabilities in the world. Much of their, also, this sort of doesn't get mentioned a lot, but you do read about their cyber attacks, but they also, their cyber command, they use for censorship inside Iran. And they're good, but they're not great, because we've tried to help get technologies to the Iranian people to help them communicate if the government decides to crack down on them. But they put in place controls that makes it very hard for the Iranian people to access social media. So accessing social media is not allowed in Iran. The foreign minister, the supreme leader, and the president all have Twitter accounts. And
they use them.
And they use them. Zarif is an inveterate user of this. So it's a hypocrite.
I wonder where he learned that.
I don't know where he learned it. Who knows? Who knows? You should explore that. But I'd like to hear your take on where Iran is and sort of where you think we have sanctioned Iran on their side. We sanctioned the secretary of the Supreme Council Cyber Command for censorship and for also human rights abuse. And so we have put sanctions on Iran's cyber capabilities.
Well, you're absolutely right. They're using cyber at home to limit the speech of dissidents. And one of the things we've learned about their cyber command is they're fabulous learners. They study what's going on in the world. So from the Chinese, they have learned how you use cyber to repress dissent at home. And the Chinese sort of run the master class on this. I mean, when I was White House correspondent during the Clinton and Bush administrations, and they would show up in China and say, you know, the internet will set you free, right? Because everybody will learn how the rest of the world and real democracies work. And instead, the Chinese, and then the Russians, and now the Iranians have learned how to use restrictions on the internet to keep their own populace down. They've done some significant attacks on the United States, the Iranians. They have, in 2012, attacked banks and financial institutions here. They attacked a small dam in Westchester County, New York, that I think they initially, we think they hit the wrong dam. They thought it was the Hoover Dam, maybe. It turned out to be a dam that I used to play on as a kid, as a 10-year-old, and I could have told them if they had asked, there's no water in it. You couldn't flood a basement with it. But they did get into the computer control systems, and the US indicted them for that and for the financial activities. They shut down the Sands Casino in Las Vegas. Can you imagine a nastier thing to do to a country than shut down their casinos? Why? Because Sheldon Adelson, who's a significant conservative donor to a number of conservative causes, showed up at Yeshiva University in New York, and with a camera running, like one is running here tonight, suggested that the US should drop an atomic weapon in the Iranian desert and glassify it, and basically tell the Iranians that Tehran is next, and that this would make them give up their nuclear program. So the Iranians saw this on YouTube, as Brian points out. They're good consumers of this stuff. And what do you know? The operators of Sheldon Adelson's casino walked into work about 3 months later and turned everything on and discovered that their hard drives had been wiped clean. And they could not turn on the casino. And then they went to some lengths to keep word of this from spreading around. Fortunately, that failed. So they've been doing a lot. But I would also say that the United States, and I can say this, Brian can't, has made Iran one of the most sought-after targets of US cyber operations. So Olympic Games, which was the code name for the operation that took out the centrifuges in the Natanz nuclear enrichment plant, was one of the things that forced the Iranians into those negotiations for the deal. That was a US and Israeli operation, which was years in the making. President Bush and President Obama both were down at various points in the Situation Room picking out targets the way Lyndon Johnson used to pick out bombing targets. The Iranian missile program has been attacked by the US in cyber ways. When the attack on the shipping happened earlier this year, US Cyber Command went in and wiped out a database of all the ships in the Gulf that the Iranian military was using to go identify the ships. And then they basically came out and told us about it. So they wanted that not to be a secret. So there is a sort of active two-way, low-level, short-of-war cyber conflict underway today, every single day, between the US and Iran, which raises the interesting question in my mind. We've heard the president talk a lot about their nuclear program. I don't think I've ever once heard him talk about their cyber program, and it's the one thing they're actually using against the US these days.
We don't talk much about cyber.
I've noticed.
It's just not, I mean, even we don't talk about the Bush or Obama and either confirming or denying it. It's just the cyber capability we don't really discuss.
Right, except that most recent stuff against the shipping in the Gulf. That the US did discuss, and they periodically have declassified just enough to try to just create the deterrence effect of saying, we've gone after this. They came out and talked about it. Does raise the interesting question, though, whether this deterrence is actually working, because we're still seeing a fair bit of Iranian cyber activity. And that attack on the Saudis that you mentioned, that was a pretty bold very precise attack against their enrichment, against their production capability in Saudi Arabia to just refine oil.
We think it proves our point, the attack. This was the world's largest oil processing facility is in a town in Saudi called Abqaiq, and it's 5% of the world's oil is processed in that facility. And on September 14th, it was struck many times, drones and missiles. And so we have said publicly that this was an attack that Iran was responsible for. I was in Saudi last week and had a number of meetings with them to talk about where they are in their investigation of the attacks.
Well, bring us up to date. Where are they? Because they haven't said very much publicly about it.
I think we're getting at the end of the investigation, the site exploitation has involved not only the Saudis but the United States, a couple of European countries, and the United Nations. We want to get the investigation done right, but I think they're getting near the end of it.
And they actually recovered some weapons that were launched against the oil refinery that did not explode. They sort of landed in the desert.
Correct, yeah.
And do those all look like they are Iranian-made?
Stay tuned. Yeah, no, they're definitely Iranian-made, but in terms of exploiting as much as we can the technology from them.
To say where they were launched from.
Exactly, yeah.
And do we think they were launched from Iran?
What we have said is that Iran is responsible for the attack. What we've also said is that the Houthis denied that they were behind it. They originally claimed credit for it and then later walked it back. The Iraqi government said that the attacks did not originate inside Iraq, and we agreed. If you look at the satellite imagery that we released, if you look at the spheroids and the towers at Abqaiq that were attacked, they're all from the north. It's very clear that this is an attack that came from the north. I think we'll let
So that meant that it either had to come from Iranian territory, from the water, or from Saudi territory. Those are your only three choices?
Well, Iran.
Or Iranian territory, I
Yeah,
said.
Iranian territory, Iraq, or maritime.
And you
Those
said
are your
Iraq,
choices.
it was not it.
Iraq said, the government said it's not us, and we agreed that it is not Iraq.
So
I
you're
think-
down to three choices.
Yeah, you're down to a small number of choices, but it wasn't just the United States. The Chancellor Merkel, President Macron, Prime Minister Johnson put out a statement after the Abqaiq attacks and said that Iran is responsible for these attacks. So we know that Iran did it. I think there is a role for the UN Security Council to play on this, because what happened was a violation of the UN Charter. It was a violation of Saudi Arabia's sovereignty. The Council is vested with the responsibility of addressing international threats to peace and security, and this meets that definition. So we would like to see sort of that move its course. But David, back to your original question over, some people say, well, gee, all these attacks sort of prove that your sanctions aren't working. We sort of look at it in a different way. We think that Iran would never do something like they're doing unless they were in perilous shape. And so we think that Iran is right now in a state of what we describe as panicked aggression. And for them to be bearing the risk of some of these attacks, which could very easily have involved a lot of civilian casualties, on Abqaiq and also the maritime attacks. No one has been killed in spite of all of these attacks on tankers. So we see Iran in a fairly desperate state, and I think that's because their economy right now is in negative 12% GDP. We have collapsed foreign direct investment. We have collapsed the oil sector, the industrial metal sector, the precious metal sector. The rial has lost 2/3 of its value. It is, and these numbers, when they start to go south, compound. And I'll be giving a speech fairly soon laying out the state of Iran's budget, the state of Iran's economy, and Iran's access to foreign exchange reserves. Looking at all of that, because the regime will sort of say that they're strong and they're robust and they're doing very well. New York Times in March had a front page top of the fold story documenting how Iran's proxies are weaker today than they have been. There was one Shia fighter.
Because they're not getting money from the Iranians.
Right. There was a Shia fighter that was quoted who said, the golden days are gone. They're never coming back. Iran just doesn't have the money that it used to. And then you have the leader of
You see what the White House is going to lose by canceling their subscriptions to the New York Times? They're never going to see stories like that anymore.
Never see stories like that.
So
And that same story also, Hassan Nasrallah, who's the leader of Lebanese Hezbollah, for the first time in Hezbollah's history, they have had to make a public appeal for donations. And then in May, the Washington Post ran a front page story also chronicling how Iran's proxies are weaker. Now that does not mean, and you alluded to this earlier, that does not mean that we have somehow eliminated the asymmetric advantage of modern terrorism. The attacks of 9/11 were quite inexpensive. So you can always do terrorism on the cheap, but there is no question that the Iranian regime and its proxies are materially weaker today than when they were, than we took office 2.5 years ago.
So we're going to turn now to questions from all of you. We'd love to start with the undergraduates. So if you've got a question, and you can just line up by there, and while you're getting out to line up, I'm going to ask Brian one more, just a short one. So during the UN meeting in September, there was this strange scene where the president of France was trying to get a conversation going between President Trump and President Rouhani, who was in New York. And he set up an open telephone line in President Rouhani in a conference room down the hall from President Rouhani's hotel room, and then sort of knocked on his door and asked if he'd come out, and President Trump was supposed to be at the other end of the phone so they could have a conversation without anybody actually picking the phone up. What was going on with that?
I don't have anything to add to that. Let's see, what can I say on that subject?
Well, first of all, it happened. It's been widely reported since, right?
We
Macron
haven't
has
confirmed any of that, I don't believe. But
the French have.
did the French confirm?
Oh, yeah.
Is that right?
Oh, yeah.
Good reporting.
Yeah.
Very good reporting. What I can say is the president is not willing to pay for a meeting. He doesn't want to give sanctions relief in order to have a meeting with Iran. The president has said many times that he would meet with the Iranians. Secretary Pompeo has said that he would meet with the Iranians without preconditions. We have been saying this for well over 2 years. The president was saying this when we were in the Iran nuclear deal. He is not willing to pay for a meeting. And this is a president who's now met with...
But a conference call is free.
But in this case, I think up in New York, and we've seen this also repeatedly, the Iranians want sanctions relief in order to get into talks with the United States. We're not willing to do that. The president has said, and we said this in May, the secretary said this in May of 2018, if we can get to a comprehensive deal, the United States is prepared to end all of our sanctions on Iran, to restore diplomatic ties, exchange ambassadors, and to welcome Iran into the international economy. But the sanctions relief comes at the end. It doesn't come at the beginning. And that's been our position. The Iranians have rejected diplomacy too many times. The president, I think, repeatedly has made the offer. But it's not just the president they've rejected. They've rejected President Macron. They've rejected Prime Minister Abe. They've also rejected overtures by the Omanis, by a number of countries to try to de-escalate, to try to get talks going, but Iran is not interested. Our position is that's fine. They can choose between sort of resolving our differences diplomatically, or they can watch their economy collapse.
Great. So we're going to start, and would each one of you simply tell us who you are and throw your questions?
Hi, I'm Christy. I'm a second year. I have 2.5 questions. So my first question is, as you've mentioned, the current Iranian leader is relatively old. The population of Iran is pretty young, and there's quite a big ideological difference between the ordinary citizens and the regime. So do you predict any internal conflicts in the near future, and how do you have any opinions on how that's going to play out? My second question is more of a general question on how effective do you think are sanctions on ideology and ideological regimes? And kind of going off of that, are there any things that people can do for the ordinary citizens that are probably the most affected by these sanctions, but less, not necessarily, ideologically involved with these decisions of the sanctions or of the aggressive actions?
Two great questions.
Very good. On the protests, the United States does not have a great record of predicting protests in Iran, pre this regime going back to the Shah. So we don't really handicap that. What we do is stand.
We did help stage a coup in the 1950s. You weren't around for that one, but that was the one protest that we timed pretty
So we
carefully.
have declassified documents on that. I've talked about this before. There have been articles that have been written lately in the last 6 months or so about this. So the coup that happened with most of the
1956.
in 56, I think 56,
Mm-hmm.
was
53. Sorry.
This was, the CIA was originally invited in for the first. They were not there for the second. And Mossadegh was overthrown by the religious establishment, the military establishment, and the political establishment. And it's not something which the regime acknowledges. They keep denying it. But if you look at what has been declassified and what has been written, you'll see, sort of setting the record straight. So on protests, there were protests in December of 2017 and January of 2018, and those were the first significant protests since the Green Revolution in 2009. I thought it was a mistake for the prior administration not to stand with the Iranian people. You had protesters holding up signs asking whether the United States stood with the mullahs or with the Iranian people. So I've always thought that those who are willing to sacrifice their lives for the cause of freedom should never have to wonder where America stands. Mm-hmm. And on that case, I thought that we redressed that in 2017 and 2018. We had all senior officials supporting the Iranian people. Many of the things that we're asking for in our policy are very similar things the Iranian people are asking for. They do not like to see tens of billions of dollars spent in Syria, in Lebanon, in all these proxies, trying to create this Iranian corridor of power, this Iranian crescent. Your average Lebanese Hezbollah fighter today makes more than your average Iranian firefighter. And that's because Iran provides Hezbollah with 70% of its operating budget. So I think the Iranian people would like to see their money invested back home and not on these foreign adventures. So we very much support that as well.
So if there was another set of protests that were coming up, you would support the U.S. vocally getting out in support in a way that the Obama administration really did.
We've already done it.
In 2009.
We did it in December 2017. And so we were very vocal, standing with the Iranian people. This regime, over the last 40 years, each decade they lose another segment of society. And it is, I think what this regime fears more than anything else is one free election. They do not, I think we talked about this earlier, it's not a regime that enjoys a lot of popular support. It is very corrupt. It is, they rob their own people blind. It's a very wealthy regime elite, and they spend a lot of money on the revolutionary aspects and on the nuclear program. They have the largest missile inventory in the Middle East. And when Iran says, well, we have this for self-defense, I just don't know how the world's leading sponsor of terrorism is entitled to a claim of self-defense.
So if I was an Iranian protester, I would take great heart from this, except if I was watching the news from Hong Kong, in which case I think I might say, where are the Americans? And so I think they might come to the conclusion that we're applying this a little bit selectively.
I can say in the case of Iran, we have been very consistent. From the time we've come into office, we have stood squarely with the Iranian people. And this is from the White House, the State Department, at all levels of both of those institutions. So we will keep doing that. I think you asked about the efficacy of our sanctions.
Or like on ideological regimes in general?
Oh, well, I would say one of the better examples of sanctions, apartheid under the Bush 41 administration. You had a global effort, I think, to diplomatically isolate the apartheid regime in South Africa, and their economy was in a free fall. And that ended up, I think, sharpening the downsides or putting the government in a position where the policy was no longer sustainable. We know that the pressure that we have put in place has no historic precedent. And that number of -12 is going to start compounding and it will get dramatically worse. At some point, the regime will discover that they cannot balance the books. I've also had our folks do an analysis of the last 40 years of the regime. They have never moderated their behavior or come to the negotiating table unless you have one or more of three things: diplomatic isolation, economic pressure, or the threat of military force. And so we have kept our post-Iran deal strategy squarely within the sort of the left-right limits of diplomacy. We've only had to talk about military force in the context of using it in self-defense if we are attacked. The regime is not going to come to the table if you talk nicely. It just doesn't work. So we have put in place the pressure that is necessary that we think will eventually result in a deal that will be permanent and comprehensive.
All right. Next question.
Also, I'm
Oh,
from Hong Kong.
She's from Hong Kong.
Thank you both for being here. I'm Edward Meyer. I'm a first year at the college. I was wondering, given that the sanctions over this past year coincided with a water crisis in Iran, to what degree has that water crisis impacted Iran's economic freefall? And also, what has the administration been doing, and is it doing, to take advantage of this coincidental timing?
Edward, good question on Iran's environmental destruction. I put out a report 13 months ago. It was the first time I think the United States government has issued a report that documents the regime's environmental destruction. And it was published before they had the water crisis in terms of the flooding. I think you're speaking about the flooding. They have also, if you look at drought maps of the country, it has been in severe drought for a long time. And farmers have lost their livelihoods because there isn't any water to grow crops. And so I'll give you one example. When this regime came into power, they had, I want to say, 7 ancient dams and about 5 modern dams. They then, over the last 40 years, have built 700 dams. These are jobs projects for the IRGC. And as a consequence, their water management system is completely out of whack. You have had a number of Iranians who have protested this, and they have protested lack of access to water. They have also protested access to clean water. The regime cracks down on environmental protesters, jails them, and kills them. There was one Iranian that I did a video about, who was the head of the Persian Wildlife Foundation, Canadian-Iranian. And he was looking at some endangered species. The regime put him in jail and then murdered him. So one of the ways the regime is very good at cracking down on dissent is they push the definition of acceptable protest so far to an extreme that it really has a chilling effect on people who then think about doing something much closer, like political, like freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press. They jail and murder environmental activists. They also murder journalists. The Committee to Protect Journalists has chronicled 4 journalists who've been killed by this regime. So we're trying to tell that story. In terms of the protests, I don't think you don't want to capitalize on somebody's misfortune, and if people are suffering, that's not something that we talk about. We did offer aid, and the regime rejected it. And there are ways that we can offer aid, but it was rejected during the floods. So we will continue to try to do that. But the protests, there is no lek walesa in Iran. There isn't any sort of solidarity movement because the regime has become, you talked about this earlier, they're very good. They have learned a lot from the Chinese and the Russians, and they're very good at, as I say, sort of defining the acceptance and defining it way outside so that they go after people who just want clean air and clean water. Good question, Edward. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Yang, 4th year in sociology. In September, Iran and China agreed to update a 25-year program signed in 2016 to include a $400 billion of investment in Iranian economy, focusing not only on developing its oil and gas, but also on upgrading Iran's transport and manufacturing infrastructure. So would the sanctions or the maximum pressure campaign be damped, given the potential that Beijing's strategic partnership with Tehran may serve as a geopolitical axis in China's goal of integrating Iran into the Belt and Road Initiative, and the fact that the profitability is not always the main motivation in China's previous investment in this region?
It's true. I think they backed out. I thought they started backing out a little bit from the deal on the energy deal that you described. I saw that initial announcement, but then I thought they walked that back. It is the case that we will sanction any sanctionable activity. And so we have sanctioned China twice now. We sanctioned some Chinese companies in July. We then sanctioned them on September 22nd. There were some subsidiaries of Costco Shipping, and these were companies that were taking Iranian crude oil. And what we have said is to countries, you can do business with the United States, you can do business with Iran, but you can't do both. And so China, there were some companies that were importing Iranian crude oil, and so we sanctioned them. We sanctioned also 5 of chief executives at some of these companies. Iran is not a normal country in terms of what it does with oil. The oil revenue goes to fund the operations of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Quds Force. And if you want to get serious about stopping the money flows that go into terror finance and weaponize all of these proxies around the Middle East, you have to get the oil to zero. And that's what we've done. The prior administration never took Iran below 1.24 million barrels of oil. They granted a lot of oil waivers. Iran has 3% of the world's oil supply. So when we got out of the Iran deal, Iran was exporting 2.5 million barrels. By June and July of just a few months ago, there were press reports of having them down around 100,000 barrels. That is a complete collapse. And this is their chief source of export revenue. So Secretary Pompeo has been vigilant about sanctioning any illicit imports of Iranian crude oil. We're going to continue to do that. We need oil to be at zero. We're going to be aggressively implementing sanctions on petrochemical and on the metal sector.
Hi, I'm a master's student, and thank you very much for the very informative conversation. And because I'm not very familiar with all this, so I'm going to ask US and Iran one-on-one questions. So since this is a controversial policy, I assume that there are pros, which you have talked about, and there should be cons. So can you put in very explicit terms, what are the cons? Like, for example, from my take on it, it's the US pretty much like broke its promise. So wouldn't that cause the younger generation in Iran, which you said they are kind of more liberal and friendly with the Western world, wouldn't that turn them, the possibly a more friendly government against US in the future? So, and wouldn't that make the rest of the world lose a bit confidence in like dealing with the US in its ability to keep its promises? So do you have any like take on that? And so is the cons, and how do you like make the decision that the pros outweigh the cons?
Not the first time I've had that question. It's a good one. The Iran nuclear deal has no legal standing in our system of government. It may have a different standing in other systems. But the legal advisor at the State Department in the prior administration said that one of the members of Congress, who happened to be at the time Mike Pompeo, asked the State Department, what legal status does the Iran nuclear deal have? And what they said was, as I mentioned earlier, there are no signatures. It's not ratified as a treaty by the Senate. And typically when you see, we've had START 1, START 2, you have a number of nuclear agreements that end up being submitted to the Senate. It was a political commitment. That is in our system of government, in our executive branch, it is a political commitment made by a president that's no longer in office. This president would like to get a deal that is much more than a political commitment, that will be permanent and that will be ratified by the Senate as a treaty. We think that is possible. And I think for people who don't understand how our system works, I can see why people would say, well, there was a deal and then you broke the deal. It was a political commitment. And as Foreign Minister Zarif will tell you, it's not even an agreement. We think there's a bigger opportunity and a better opportunity to get a comprehensive deal that doesn't have sunset clauses, that addresses Iran's ballistic missile proliferation, its missile testing, its regional aggression of Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestine Islamic Jihad, the Houthis in Yemen, its proxies in Iraq and Syria, its underground cells in Bahrain. And that's just in the Middle East, to say nothing of all the terrorism they've committed in Europe and Argentina, around the world. So we have got in place, we think, a much better policy. And we think we're in a good position to accomplish our goals.
Sorry, just to follow up, what
Yeah.
do you think the young people in Iran would feel about?
Oh, the wrong young people in Iran? Well, much of what, I don't want to give a percentage to this, but the regime, because of the censorship they do, it is not an open and transparent society. Iran does not believe in freedom of the press. The Constitution in '79 talks about it, but that's not a right that has been delivered upon by this regime. So I think what the Iranian people know is only what they're able to, through their workarounds, try to find out what's on the internet. We have tried to get our message out. The State Department has 5 social media platforms in Farsi, and we put out a lot of content on a daily basis. And so I have tried to reach the Iranian people as best I can. We try to explain to them, like our sanctions regime, which is focused on the issues we've talked about today. We have exceptions for food, medicine, medical devices, agricultural products. We want that to get through to the Iranian people. The regime is the biggest obstacle to getting humanitarian assistance to the Iranian people. So I think the Iranian people have had 40 years of experience with this regime. When President Rouhani was elected in 2013, inflation was at 39%. He promised that he would reform Iran's economy. Inflation today is in the mid to upper 40s. And the Iranian people blame, I think, Rouhani and the supreme leader for the economic troubles they face. We're now seeing similar protests against Iranian influence in Lebanon and in Iraq, because when the Iranian regime comes in and they bring in their economic model, which is deeply corrupt, you see people are tired of the corruption around Hezbollah, and then you also see some frustration with Iranian influence in Iraq, and the people have taken to the street protesting that. Our position is that the people of Lebanon and Iraq would like their country back, and that the supreme leader of Iran should stay within his own borders.
Well, we are not out of questions, but we are, alas, out of time. So I want to thank you all for coming down. I want to thank you, Brian, for
Thank you, David.
putting up with so many questions from me and everybody else in the audience. And I thank you all for coming. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks.